A woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed, and the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically, and that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the two women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it, and she's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat, and she had to fight back tears. I mean, she knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. I mean, she was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. I mean, that was the reason really why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. I mean, she felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never gonna find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life, and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, "You know what? I'm okay. I'm just totally exhausted from travel, and I'm gonna go to bed." The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the two women hugged. And then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed, and then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning, and she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows, and it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed-looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad. And as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down and she flings open the shed and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too, like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on. But in she goes, and she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. But they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And, Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here. But she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off. She put it over this woman. And then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. and all night the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she'd stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed. And she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help. And a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help. And the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. This was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. She doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. She had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, but as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired. She actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden, dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. Really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room. But she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and, dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute, like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like, clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded the ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. It was this horrible fire. Everyone's trying to evacuate. And this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. This stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat, just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there, and for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, They flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. I mean, it was a very rough lifestyle. And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close, and she's just walking, and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps, and a man walks into the bedroom. And it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned. And now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. I mean, people really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her. On the afternoon of October 16th, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip. And when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof. But the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town, that at night it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling the story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it. And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the cistone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. He was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church, and for a second the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened, or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it, and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sofia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. That must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched this stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away, get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cistone. But behind them, Sofia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cistone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cistone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sofia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sofia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cistone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique, at this point, did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there, but Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it. He's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on. And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sofia heard the sound of this stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together. Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal? And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sofia, and he goes, yeah, I think this place really is haunted. And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Serkos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart, looking for this general. And they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Serkos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, okay, show us proof. But the elderly man said, well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried. And so the soldier said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Serkos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Serkos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, go, dig that one up. But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, no way, we're not going near that grave. And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave, but because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through, and so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog, and she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her, and so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped, and all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church, and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside, and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sofia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sofia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicky Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The 3 of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicky began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicky turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicky noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicky just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicky really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicky thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicky was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicky sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicky screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicky, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicky and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicky, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a U.S. military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out. They said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen. They just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time. But eventually they both did fall asleep, and then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up, and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, and so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty. And eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated, when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment, because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about this strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working, because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier, because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars, and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there, and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they'd seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating, because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. Of January 13th, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked in the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. He had just come back from visiting his grandmother, and now he was feeling really sick. Inside of his apartment, it was blazing hot, but that was by design. That's how he kept the temperature. Ronald took off his coat and threw it over one of the many handmade wooden cages that were strewn about his living room. Then he dragged himself over to his house phone, picked it up, and he called the auto dealership where he worked. When the office manager answered, Ronald told her that he would not be able to come into work the following day because he was feeling so unwell. He hung up the phone and then leaned on the counter for a second, feeling lightheaded. Then suddenly, from behind him, he heard a hiss. Right away, Ronald turned around and walked over to his fridge, and instinctively, he reached out his right hand to open the door. But as soon as he grabbed the handle and squeezed, he felt a shot of pain in his right hand. He had forgotten that his right hand was all bandaged up because it was injured. And so grimacing, Ronald reached out with his left hand and he opened up the fridge that way. Then, after shutting the fridge, he walked over to the kitchen counter and he reached into a jar and he pulled out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were about 2 inches long each and they wriggled around inside of his hand. He threw the cockroaches onto the ground and then watched as they scattered. Now that Ronald's chores were finished, he decided he would just go lay down because again, he's feeling horrible. But as he walked across the kitchen towards his bedroom, that dizziness he was feeling earlier came back. And suddenly it was like the whole world was spinning around him and he could barely stay on his feet. He kept trying to walk towards his bedroom, but he just couldn't do it. And eventually he stumbled and began to fall. Ronald lurched sideways and blindly stumbled to the right, trying to catch himself. And the first thing he touched with his outstretched arm was the door to his apartment. And so he grabbed it and he tried to stay on his feet, but he couldn't. And so he turned his body around and pressed his back up against the door to steady himself. But he was just so woozy and weak that eventually he just kind of slouched down to the ground, back against the door, feet out in front of him. Slowly, he let his eyes close. As Ronald passed out, all he could hear were the sounds of roaches scurrying and chicken bones crunching. 3 days later, Ronald's neighbor heard the crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. He opened his door and he saw 2 police officers and the superintendent of their building standing in front of Ronald's door. So this neighbor liked Ronald and knew him to be a nice, quiet guy, and so he couldn't imagine why police would be at his door. But then he thought about it, and he actually hadn't seen Ronald in several days. The neighbor watched as the police officers knocked on Ronald's door, waiting for Ronald to come out, but the door never opened. And after a few minutes of knocking, the police finally stepped back from the door and gestured for the superintendent to step forward and use his key to open the door. And then after the superintendent had done that, the neighbor watched as the police officers tried to open the door, but couldn't. It was like there was something really heavy blocking the door from opening. Finally, both police officers leaned hard enough on the door that they got it to open up just a little bit. The neighbor watched as the officers stuck their heads into the apartment and then jumped back with their hands on their guns. Then one of the cops grabbed their radio and began frantically talking into it, and then the neighbor watched as the officers and the superintendent quickly walked down the hallway out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door partially open. And as the neighbor heard the sound of sirens wailing outside, he took a cautious step into the hallway and realized he could actually see into Ronald's apartment through the open door. And what he saw inside of there was so horrifying that for a second, the neighbor just froze. And then a second later, he backed into his own apartment and slammed the door behind him. Hours later, this neighbor could not get the image of what he had seen in Ronald's apartment out of his head. So he grabbed a piece of paper and just began sketching the bizarre scene. It would turn out Ronald had a secret. And on the evening of January 13th, 2002, right after Ronald had called in sick to his work, that secret killed him. Here is the picture that the neighbor drew of what he saw inside of Ronald's apartment. On the floor is Ronald's dead body. His face, his ears, his hands, and his internal organs had all been eaten. And surrounding Ronald were the giant monitor lizards that he was secretly keeping as pets. He had 7 of them, which he fed roaches and raw chicken and allowed to just free roam his apartment. They ranged in size from 2 feet to 6 feet long. These are massive lizards. And unfortunately for Ronald, not only are monitor lizards carnivores, but also their mouths are filled with deadly bacteria. The reason Ronald's hand was bandaged up, his right hand, is because one of his lizards, a week prior to his death, had bit his hand, and the bacteria had given him this horrible staph infection. And it was that staph infection, a week later, that very likely caused him to pass out inside of his apartment. And then after that, he was eaten by the lizards. Now, it's assumed he died from the staph infection and then was consumed. However, the autopsy couldn't prove that, and so it is possible he may have been still alive when they began to eat him. After Robert's death, his lizards were taken from his apartment and placed in the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland. Williams was a young boy. His parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor. There's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the 2 zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on CCTV footage, and it was also the day that they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside of Gareth's apartment was jacked way up, so it was very hot inside of his apartment, despite the fact it was summer, and it was the height of the summer in August. But regardless, the excessive heat in his apartment sped up the decomposition process and made it impossible to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when 2 experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death. Growing up, Pauline Dakin always suspected that there was just something off about her family. And years later, she would find out she was right. In 1970, when she was 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. And to Pauline, it wasn't that much of a shock because her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker and he was extremely violent. But after they separated and Pauline, her mother, and brother had moved into another house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada, Pauline noticed her mom started to act really anxious all the time, but she never knew why. When Pauline was 9, her mother told her and her brother that they were going to go on a vacation to Winnipeg, which is 1,000 miles away from Vancouver. And so they loaded up the van, they hopped in, and they drove all the way to Winnipeg. And when they got out, they went inside their new vacation home, and Ruth informed her children that they were actually never going back to Vancouver. And when Pauline and her brother said, "Why? Dad's still back in Vancouver. I want to see Dad." But Pauline said, "Sorry kids, this is the way it has to be, and when you're old enough, I'll explain everything." Confused and sad, Pauline and her brother began starting a new life in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, Pauline never saw her father, and so she lost touch with him. But she started making a couple close friends in Winnipeg, and she was starting to feel like this was home. But right as she was starting to feel normal, her mother told her and her brother that they needed to move right now all over again. This time they were going to go all the way to New Brunswick, the far east side of Canada. Their mother made them swear they would tell no one about this move. But later that day, when Pauline was with her best friend Wendy, she let it slip that she was moving, and so when Ruth came to pick Pauline up from Wendy's house, the two girls had to affect these sort of breezy goodbyes to each other so that Pauline's mother wouldn't suspect anything. Once in New Brunswick, the family did put down roots and they stayed there for many years, but Pauline's mother still was just incredibly anxious and paranoid about something. The kids just had no idea what it was. Fast forward to 1988, when Pauline was 23 years old, she had moved 2 hours away from the family home in New Brunswick and was living with her boyfriend and was working as a reporter at a local newspaper. And during that time, her mother called her and said, "Hey, I'd like to meet you at a motel. I'm finally ready to tell you everything about your childhood." Pauline was really intrigued and excited. This was a conversation that was literally decades in the making. And so Pauline eagerly went to the motel. She saw her mother waiting outside, kind of pacing around, looking very anxious. And so she walks up to her mom and she waves and she's about to speak when her mother just looks up at her and puts her finger over her lips, telling her to be quiet. And then she jams an envelope into Pauline's hands. And on the envelope, it just says, "Don't say anything. Put your jewelry inside of this envelope. It's probably bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak." And so now Pauline's really confused, but she did as she was told. She took her jewelry off, put it in the envelope, and gave it back to her mother. And then the two of them silently walked into the motel, into the room where Pauline's mother was staying. When they went inside, there was a man sitting in the middle of the room that Pauline immediately recognized. It was the reverend of their church when they used to live in Vancouver. His name was Stan Sears, and Pauline's mother had been his secretary the whole time they'd gone to that church. Pauline always knew her mother and Stan were close friends, and in fact had kept in touch after they left Vancouver and were in Winnipeg and then New Brunswick. In fact, Pauline remembers periodically seeing Stan show up in Winnipeg and New Brunswick to visit with Pauline's mother. So it was a surprise, but not a total shock, when Pauline's mother confessed to her that in fact she and Stan had fallen in love. And in fact, they had had a secret relationship from the time they lived in Vancouver. But this revelation was nothing compared to what Pauline heard next. Her mother explained that the reason they had had to move so many times during her childhood was because Pauline's father, Warren, was actually a mobster and was a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after they separated, Pauline's mother found out she had a hit put on her head because the mob now believed that the husband could not control her anymore and she knew too much. Stan also found out that he had a hit on his head because Ruth discovered that the mob wanted to kill him too because they knew about their relationship. And then also, apparently Stan was counseling a man that was in his congregation that wound up being a mobster, and so the mob believed this man had given up critical information to Stan, making him even more of a liability. At first, Stan said he didn't believe any of this, but when he found out the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, he knew it was true. They decided not to tell the police and instead go into hiding together because Pauline's mother knew what happened to families that snitched on the mob. They were made examples of. And so when Pauline and her family moved to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan actually moved there as well in tandem, which is why Pauline had seen him periodically showing up at their house to visit with Pauline's mother. Pauline was understandably completely shocked. But at the same time, she was kind of happy to have some sort of explanation for all the strange things that had happened in her childhood. And so over the course of the next several hours, Pauline sat in this motel room with her mother and Stan and asked them every question she could think of. And she discovered that whenever she came home from school and she found her mother furiously pulling all the food out of the fridge and the pantry, throwing it all away with no explanation, that was actually because they found out the mob had tried to poison them. Or these 6 different times Pauline was unenrolled from the school she was at and then moved to a different school across town, that was because there was a credible threat the mob had discovered where Pauline was going to school. And so by the end of the weekend, Pauline not only learned about this totally crazy past she had, but she also learned that she was still in danger. And so before Pauline headed back home, she asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. And Pauline's mother said, well, that's actually the reason we called you here now, because after all these years, we were just tired of being in hiding, and so we've already spoken to the authorities, and they've moved us into a special witness protection program for families connected to the mob. When you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world, where basically you're not really safe, but you have agents that follow you around that are undercover, that track what you're doing and make sure there's no assassination attempt on you. And before Pauline could even ask, her mother told her that as a measure of her and Stan entering the weird world, they asked that a couple of agents monitor Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know they were being monitored. At this point, Stan reached forward with a radio and he said, here's a radio that actually broadcasts to the agents that are following you pretty much all the time. But you should only use it if you're truly in a desperate situation, because as soon as you call out for help, there are going to be people that are risking their lives to come save you. As Pauline is holding this radio, she looks at her mom and Stan and she says, well, what happened to Dad? Is he in jail? And at this point, Pauline's mother says, no, he's not. He's in the weird world too. And she handed Pauline a letter that was from her father addressed to Pauline, and it basically spelled out that he had been moved into the weird world and he was looking forward to Pauline joining them at some point when she was ready. So now Pauline has this radio and this letter, and she's looking at her mother and Stan, and she's just totally overwhelmed, and her mother just tells her, go home, think about what you want to do next, and if you want to join the witness protection program and join the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen. And so Pauline, who's in a total state of shock, gives her mom a hug and gives Stan a hug and says, okay, bye, I'll be in touch. And she leaves the motel and she gets in her car and she's about to back up when she looks and sees Stan running outside holding something in his hand. And so Pauline stops, Stan runs up to the window, and he says, hey, I forgot to give you this. And he held up this round piece of metal that he told her was a GPS transponder. It was magnetized, and she should put it out of sight underneath her car. And what it does is it constantly gives off her location to the agents that are following her. So if she was in trouble, it would be easier for them to find her. And so Pauline thanked him, put the transponder under her car, and Stan went back into the motel. And so Pauline went back home with the intention of just digesting this information, knowing that she was being watched, she had this radio, she was, relatively safe, and her plan was to just give it a couple of days before she committed to joining the witness protection program and joining the weird world. But after only a couple of days, her paranoia was so high that she dumped her boyfriend, she quit her job, and she moved out of her house into a separate apartment, and she called her mother and said, I can't take it anymore, I feel totally unsafe, I want to join the weird world. Her mother and Stan were delighted at her decision, but they told her it wasn't a simple process getting into the weird world, that a lot of people were involved in her basically giving up her old life and entering this new one. And so Pauline's mother told her that she would be in touch with one of her agents and they would contact Pauline when it was time for her to go. And in that time, Pauline met a new boyfriend, Kevin, who became her husband. And in conversations with him, Pauline started to doubt this whole mafia thing was even true. And so she decided, in order to find out if this really was a real thing, that the mafia was actually after them, that Pauline would need to set up a sting operation on her mother and Stan. And so Pauline called her mother and very convincingly told her that, oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was someone from the mafia. I don't know what happened, but can you tell me what to do? Should I call the police? What do I do? And her mother said, no, don't call the police. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see if he knows what to do. And just a couple of minutes later, Pauline's mother called back and said, okay, honey, I spoke to Stan and he spoke to the undercover agents that sit outside your house and have been watching you for all these years. And they said that, yes, unfortunately, not one, but 2 men from the mafia broke into your house today. But luckily, they went up, they grabbed them, they're in custody, so you're safe now. And Pauline said, Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here the whole day. I lied to you. No one broke in. And it was at this point that Pauline realized her mother and Stan had been living a lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster in some Vancouver crime syndicate. It was all made up. It would turn out Stan was suffering from something called delusion syndrome, where totally normal people that are totally lucid and have normal lives have one distinct delusion. And sometimes that delusion is not a big deal. But sometimes it is, like they believe the mafia is after them. And during his relationship with Pauline's mother, he passed on his delusion to her through something called folie à deux, which translates to madness for two, which is shared delusion syndrome, where someone who's delusional, who's a dominant personality, can pass that on to a subordinate personality. After confronting her mother and then also confronting Stan at a later date, neither of them said, "This is a lie, you're right, you caught us," because they believed it, and they took to their graves the belief that the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline said this isn't true was not that they had been exposed as potential frauds. It was that, oh no, Pauline's going to expose herself to the mafia because she's not using her GPS transponder or her radio or living in the weird world with us. She's going to get assassinated by the mafia. And so even though Pauline never got an apology from her mother or got to really talk about the insanity of this whole situation, because again, her mother and Stan took to the graves the belief that the mafia was in fact after them, Pauline ultimately made peace with the situation by writing a best-selling. On September 15, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room and he put it at the foot of the bed and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough, put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband, and he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the 2 coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door, and right away they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his 2 left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the 2 co-workers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, "You know, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something." So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only 2 marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped outside. He had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them. But Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those 2 things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, "Look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide, and my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him." When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to 2 theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these 2 electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed and they went outside in the hall and they saw Greg and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband, and Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent, and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues have been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah, Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene. He showed him the hotel room. And then afterwards, he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos. And the next day, when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh, really? You figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple. And when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. And Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay. So I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly. And as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette, and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed, and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers, and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground, and then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall, and he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside. He goes next door to room 349. They go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops and he looks up at Apple and he takes his finger and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out, there was a hole in the heart, and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body. Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake, and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Muller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in and he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance, and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Mueller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field and they start digging. And pretty quickly their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them, and he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground, and he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep, and then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized, and then at this point Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. On July 20th, 1968, a small fishing boat called El Fausto took off from their port on La Palma Island, which is part of the Canary Islands, which is a Spanish archipelago, and they took off for El Hierro, which was another island about 50 miles to the south. On board El Fausto were 3 very experienced fishermen and sailors. They were the brothers Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, as well as their cousin Miguel Acosta. Their trip to El Hierro was uneventful. It took about 7 hours. They arrived at the port in the early evening hours, and they unloaded their cargo onto the island, which was actually explosives used in agriculture. So they unloaded all that, and then the 3 of them went to get some food and relax for a few minutes before they came back to the dock and began preparing to leave. So that evening, as the 3 men are standing on their boat, repacking the ship and getting ready to leave in the next few minutes, they see this man running down the dock who's frantically waving at them, trying to get their attention. And so they stop what they're doing and they beckon him over and say, what do you need? And the man introduced himself as Julio Garcia. He was clearly very upset. He was talking really quickly and they had to slow him down a couple times to try to understand what he was saying. But he communicated that his wife had called him earlier that day, and she said their 2-year-old daughter was very sick and he needed to come home right away. And he ran down to catch the ferry back to his home island of La Palma, so the same island these 3 men are from, and he missed the ferry. And the next ferry going back to his home island was not for another 2 days. And so Julio was running up and down the dock trying to flag anybody who owned a ship that might be willing to take him to La Palma, even if it was out of the way. He was prepared to pay for it. And so, of course, the El Fausto crew said, we're actually going to La Palma. We live there too, and we'd be happy to take you. You don't need to pay for this. And so Julio begins to help them load the rest of their equipment onto the boat, which included some food. They had 22 pounds of fruit and they had some fresh water. And then once once everything was loaded up, they undid their lines and they set sail for La Palma. They took off at about 2:30 in the morning on July 21st. The water was very calm during their return trip. The only thing they had to contend with was a light mist that formed over the water in the early morning hours right after the sun came up, but it really wasn't enough to affect their ability to navigate. But even if the mist was more severe than people realized, Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel were very experienced sailors that in fact had been sailing on this particular stretch of water ever since they were teenagers, and they had navigated these waters in far worse conditions and had always managed to get through it. But at 10 a.m. that morning, when the Fausto crew was supposed to arrive at La Palma, they didn't. And the owner of the boat itself was waiting at the dock for them, and when they didn't show up, he wasn't overly concerned because he knew these three men. He regularly went out on this particular boat with them. In fact, he normally would have gone on the trip to El Hierro with them, but he had commitments on La Palma, so he didn't go. And so he's not particularly worried about them. He figures they ran into some mechanical issue and, they're getting it figured out, but they're just late. But after a little while, the families of the El Fausto crew started to ask the owner, where are they? Why aren't they here? And so the owner, who again is not overly concerned, but wants to make sure the families are not worrying, says, you know what? I'll send a search boat that will take the exact route El Fausto was on, but in reverse, and I'm sure they can just drive straight out there and they'll run into them and they will help them fix, whatever issue they have, which is more than likely mechanical. That's an old boat, and we've certainly run into other mechanical issues in the past. So this search boat goes out, and for hours and hours and hours, they're looking along the exact same charted course that El Fausto was supposed to be on, and they're nowhere to be found. And so they radio back in to the owner of the boat and they say, look, we can't find him. What do you want us to do? And he called them back in, and he realized that, if we can't find them anywhere near the route, that probably something more sinister has happened to them. And it was at this point that he got in touch with authorities, and they launched a much more formal search and rescue effort. Planes and boats spilled out over the sea to look for El Fausto and her crew, and everybody who was looking was operating with an enormous sense of urgency, because anybody who was looking had been told, these guys don't have much in the way of supplies. They have 22 pounds of fruit, and they have a very limited freshwater supply. And so if we don't find them within a couple of days, there's a very good chance that we're going to find 4 corpses. But despite searchers' motivation to find these guys, a couple of days passed and there was no sign of them. And unfortunately, people did start to think, I think it's more likely we're going to find 4 dead bodies than 4 sailors waiting to be rescued. But on July 25th, 4 days after El Fausto left El Hierro on their way to La Palma and then, of course, got lost, 4 days after that, a British ship called Duquesa radioed in an incredible message. They said they had found this fishing boat that was drifting along, and there was 4 people standing on the deck, and they were waving flashlights around to try to get their attention. And as this British ship moved up closer to the fishing boat, they were able to read on the hull the call sign of the boat, and it was, of course, El Fausto. Where El Fausto had been found was 120 miles west of La Palma, so they had drifted way, way off course. But once they pulled up alongside of them, they could see that not only were the 4 crew members alive, they actually seemed like they were in pretty good spirits. They certainly were dehydrated and were very thankful to get some water, and they were starving, and they were obviously pretty freaked out because they had just been adrift in the middle of the ocean and probably were realizing that this could end really badly for us. But beyond all that, they seemed okay. And very quickly, that message was passed to friends and family of the El Fausto crew back on La Palma, who's waiting anxiously to hear any news about their loved ones. And when they were told they had been found and they were alive, they were overjoyed because they thought they were dead. But after the initial transmission had been sent out by Duquesa saying, hey, we found the crew and they're alive and they're good, well, a couple hours went by and the Duquesa sent another transmission that was very strange. They said the crew of El Fausto was refusing to be towed back home. They were saying that our boat's just fine, we're good, we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. And so the captain of Duquesa says to the men, then why are you out here? How did you get 120 miles west of La Palma? Something had to have gone wrong with your boat. So what happened? But the men didn't really answer his question. They just said, oh no, there's nothing wrong with our boat. There's no mechanical issues. Everything's fine. We appreciate your offer, but we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. Even Julio, who had made this special effort to get home to his sick daughter and to see his wife, even he is saying, no, we don't need a tow, we're good. And so the captain of the Duquesa is looking at these guys thinking, what am I missing here? You just drifted 120 miles away. You probably should have died. You're very lucky that we happened to find you in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Had we not found you, you probably would have died of dehydration in the next couple of days. And so we found you. We're offering to bring you to shore to guarantee that you will get to see your sick daughter and to see your wife and for you all to see your families and your friends. And you're telling us to leave, and you're telling us that there's nothing wrong with your boat when clearly something happened. But the captain of the Duquesa could not convince them to get towed in. They were totally not going to do it. And apparently they were very polite about it. They said, look, we really appreciate the offer, but really our boat is just fine. We just need some food, water, cigarettes, and some fuel, and we'll be good. And so ultimately, the crew of the Duquesa obliged their request, and they gave them 18 hours worth of fuel along with a whole bunch of cigarettes and water and food. And they watched as the four men sailed east towards La Palma, and they were waving the whole time. Everything seemed fine. And then they vanished over the horizon. And the captain of Duquesa would call in over the radio that based on where they were and how close they were to La Palma, they should expect to see them arriving at port at about 7 p.m. that night. Back on La Palma, friends, family, and hundreds of other people from the island went down to the dock and were drinking wine and having a big party, celebrating the imminent return of their friends and their loved ones. But unfortunately, 7 p.m. came and went, and they didn't show up. And so, of course, the family of the crew became very worried that, oh my gosh, this nightmare is starting all over again. And the owner of El Fausto came over to them and reassured them that he's been in touch with the authorities who were speaking to the captain of the Duquesa, who were speaking to our friends and family and loved ones on El Fausto, and everything's fine. They have all the supplies they need. They have all the fuel they need. I'm sure they're just running a little bit late. Everything is totally fine. And so friends and family and some diehard supporters stayed down at the dock for several more hours until it became clear that something's gone wrong, and unfortunately this nightmare is not over. The next morning, after El Fausto and her crew were once again labeled missing, Spain kicked off their largest ever search for missing people. They had bombers flying overhead, they had military and civilian ships all over the area where the Duquesa had made contact with El Fausto. They had so many people combing the water, so many planes overhead, and for 2 weeks they looked everywhere and they couldn't find anything. And finally, they had to call it off. And they said, look, we don't know what happened to them. And they declared them lost at sea, which basically meant we think they're dead, but we'll probably never know for sure. 2 months later, on October 9th, an Italian merchant ship called the Anna de Mayo, who was on their way to Venezuela, spotted a small fishing boat way off in the distance that was just bobbing around aimlessly. And the first thing they noticed was, this ship is far too small to be making a cross-oceanic voyage. They shouldn't be out here. And as they got closer, they could tell that there was no one standing on deck or in the cabin. There's no one driving this boat. And so finally they got so close they could read the hull, and it says El Fausto. So the Anna de Mayo pulls up right alongside El Fausto. They tether themselves together so it doesn't float away. And two of the Italian sailors get on board El Fausto, and they're yelling out to see if anybody's there, but no one's responding. And they're looking around, and the ship is in great condition. There's no sign of obvious damage or any violence that might have taken place on here. They go into the cabin where the steering wheel is, and they're looking for some sort of logbook that would have documented what happened on the ship, but there's no logbook. And so the Italians were left scratching their head thinking, how could a perfectly seaworthy boat wind up abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Where's their crew? But they still needed to go down below into the little space that was the engine room. And so the two sailors that had boarded to look around, they make their way over to the section of the deck where there's this hatch that they open up, and they look down and they smell this horrible smell, and they turn on their light and they're met with this horrible and inexplicable scene. Laying on the ground inside of the engine room on his back was a dead man who was partially mummified. He had no clothes on, and he was clutching a transistor radio. And so the two Italians that found him, they stepped back and they had to compose themselves. And then one of them actually went down to look around for clues and see if perhaps there's other bodies down there. And so when he went down, it was just the one body, and he could only find one other clue, and it was this small notebook that was positioned right behind the dead body that they didn't see when they first looked down. So the Italian sailors leave the engine room and they take the notebook back to their ship, and they open it up, and the first thing they see is the middle section of the notebook has been torn out. In fact, 28 pages were missing, and all they were left with was a couple of pages at the beginning and a single page at the end. The first couple of pages just were a couple of notes and some simple math calculations. Nothing significant. The last page appeared to be a farewell of sorts, but the language that was used was a little bit confusing and it was difficult to read, and so the Italians were not entirely sure what any of it actually meant. And so they figured it would be best to just give the notebook to authorities and they could figure out what it meant. And so the captain of the Ana de Mayo radios in to Spanish authorities that they've found El Fausto and that they intend to tow it back to Venezuela, where they were already going, at which point they'll turn over everything they found and authorities can take it from there. So the Italians put a tow line on the bow of El Fausto and began towing. 2 days later, Spanish authorities received a crushing telegram. Apparently the night before, as El Fausto was being towed, it suddenly lurched forward and went bow down into the water and sunk so rapidly that it ripped the tow line off of the back of the Ana de Mayo and was underwater well before they could do anything to try to stop it. The crew of the Ana de Mayo swore they had followed procedure and they knew what they were doing, and this was just kind of a freak thing, but regardless of how or why it happened, the ship was now gone, and so too was the dead body, so they couldn't even positively identify whoever that was. All they had was that notebook they recovered from inside the engine room. The notebook was sent to La Palma, where it was put in front of the families of the 4 men who were on El Fausto, and very quickly Julio's wife was able to identify his handwriting. He apparently had a unique way of writing and she was used to reading it, and so she said, "That's definitely his writing, and in fact I recognize that notebook." He kept that notebook to track payments because he was a mechanic and people requested his services, and that's what he used to track payments. This of course meant the dead man inside of the engine room was almost certainly Julio. Julio's wife examined the notebook and she was able to decipher that last page, at least most of it, and she said it was this very detailed description of exactly what she needed to do once he died, because clearly, based on the way he was writing, he knew he was about to die. And at first it says, here's how you access my insurance policy, and here are the different properties I own, and how you go about selling them. And then in his final moments, he scrawled one last message at the very bottom of the last page that said, "Don't ever tell our son all that has happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate for me. Love you." So if Julio was so sure he was about to die that he would take the time to write out a detailed list of instructions for his wife to follow when he died, well then why didn't he take the time to also offer a small explanation as to what happened to he and the other crew members of El Fausto? He had to have known that whoever was going to find his dead body and this notebook was going to have an awful lot of questions. Unless he did know that and did write a description, except it was in those 28 pages in the middle of the notebook that had been removed. And if that's the case, then who removed them and why? And where's the rest of the El Fausto crew? And why did they tell the Duquesa that nothing was wrong with their ship? And why didn't they take the tow into shore, which would have guaranteed their safety? There's just so many questions that have never been answered in 50 years. The most widely accepted theory is the crew of El Fausto experienced a series of small but compounding setbacks that, combined with panic, led to really bad decision making and ultimately their death. Others say there are just too many anomalies and oddities about this case to just be a product of bad decision making, that there has to be something else going on. And so there are lots of alternative theories about what happened, ranging from abduction to illegal trafficking gone wrong, to perhaps they saw something they shouldn't have. But sadly, no one will know for sure what happened to these guys until there is a major break in the case. And at this point, people are just hoping those missing 28 pages turn up and that those will be able to explain what happened to El Fausto and her crew.